This episode of Sustainability Defined is brought to you by Enel X, the makers of Juicebox smart EV charging stations. Learn how to lower emissions and save on electricity with smart electric vehicle charging. Visit juiceboxstore.com for more info.
Hey listeners, a quick note before we start the show. We first want to wish all of our listeners around the world good health during this trying time. We also want to inform you that this entire episode was recorded and edited prior to when the coronavirus started to cause widespread havoc around the world. As a result, this episode has our trademark bad jokes and the light tone that we take in each of our episodes to make these complex sustainability topics engaging and approachable for all listeners. Our hope is that this episode provides you with some levity during this difficult time.
We also believe that the topic for this episode, e-mobility, is an important one to cover and for you to hear. The need to address climate change through a rethink of our transportation system continues to be an urgent issue. The transportation sector is a significant source of global greenhouse gas emissions. In this episode, we provide insights on the future of our transportation system through e-mobility and how you can take part in that transition. As always, thank you for listening to our show. Stay safe and healthy, and enjoy.
All right, listeners, welcome back to Sustainability Defined, where Jay and I are here defining sustainability one concept and one bad joke at a time. Today, Jay and I are here talking about e-mobility. We both rode on our e-scooters back home, didn't we, Jay?
As we do every day, Scott. Today's no different.
No, I'm scared of e-scooters. I don't think I've ever ridden one.
Oh, Scott, they're most fun, but it's not quite our topic today.
It kind of is. Part of e-mobility. But go ahead. Go over the outline.
So, listeners, Scott, we're going to start by asking, what is e-mobility? Then we're going to ask, why is e-mobility important? Then we'll ask what's needed to make e-mobility a reality. And then how do we accelerate the transition to e-mobility? Then we'll ask, are there any potential issues with the transition to e-mobility?
Let's branch for the last one.
And then we will branch into our profile of Enel X and our interviewee, Giovanni Bertolino.
All right, so what is e-mobility? Electric mobility, or e-mobility, refers to the use of transportation modes that are fully or partly driven with an electric drivetrain versus a conventional gas powertrain, and have a means of storing energy on board via battery and obtain their energy mainly from the power grid. All right, so by power grid, we mean the interconnected system that delivers energy from generation to consumer. Electric cars, electric scooters, e-bikes, e-buses, and e-trucks could all be examples of e-mobility.
And, of course, shout out to episode 1 on electric bikes, which we replayed last month with a short update.
Right.
So, all right, let's ask, why is e-mobility important in the first place? So, the transportation sector is responsible for a significant portion of the greenhouse gas emissions accelerating climate change. Mm-hmm. In the U.S., transportation accounted for the largest portion of total greenhouse gas emissions at 29%. And globally, transportation accounts for 24% of emissions and is expected to grow faster than any other sector.
Okay, so transportation is a big part of our global greenhouse gas emissions, and road vehicles actually make up 72% of transportation emissions. So most of these are light vehicles, but heavy-duty vehicles like big trucks tend to have a much larger impact per mile.
So in this episode, we're focusing on light-duty vehicles because in the U.S., light-duty vehicles make up 59% of greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector.
Right, so like light-duty vehicles, we mean like basic cars. Like my brother and I used to refer to our Mitsubishi Galant as the definition of car. Just basic.
Got you from point A to point
special.
B.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's probably some emissions that we'll touch on later. So with cars, there are several different options that would all fall under this e-mobility umbrella. So let's run through them.
All right, so there's 4. One is hybrid, A hybrid has both an electric and an internal combustion engine. It's charged via the engine while driving, and it stores braking energy at the same time. So an example of this is like the standard Toyota Prius. Second is a plug-in hybrid. The important difference with these is you can also charge the battery via the grid. An example is the Honda Clarity. Third is the range extended electric vehicle. With these, there's still an internal combustion engine, and it generates power for the electric powertrain through the use of a generator. So the difference with the range extended ones versus the hybrids is the internal combustion engine does not directly power the vehicle. It comes into play once the battery is exhausted. An example is the Chevy Volt, which can be plugged in and has an internal combustion engine. The fourth is battery electric vehicles. These are what we are going to call EVs. The vehicle is powered entirely by the battery, which is charged via the grid. An example would be the Nissan Leaf and Tesla models.
All right, so having broken down those 4 different types of what could fall under e-mobility, it's also important to note that besides greenhouse gas emissions, e-mobility is also important because non-electric cars spew pollutants that can lead to worse air quality. Transportation accounts for more than half of the nitrogen oxides in our air. Nitrogen oxides, or NOx, can cause lung irritation and weaken the body's defenses against respiratory infections. Besides NOx and greenhouse gases, other major pollutants from motor vehicles are particulate matter, volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, and sulfur dioxide, basically all those ides that you don't really like to hear.
No.
And Scott, here's an example that stuck with me related to this. Google measures air quality using equipment mounted on Google Street View cars, and San Francisco was one of the first cities analyzed. So when this came out, I could zoom into my block and see the nitrous oxide outside my front door, which is a little disconcerting. Listeners, for more details on this Google initiative, check out episode 26 on big data and sustainability.
I like how you heard about this, and the first thing you did was, I got to look this up and see what I'm breathing.
Yeah, let me just give myself a dose of bad news. But it's crazy. I mean, you can see literal streets in these maps because cars go down them, and you can tell which ones are heavier used than others.
And now it'd be nice if the walking directions from Google take this into account. Like, walk 2 blocks further. You'll avoid some
Kate
knocks.
Brandt, if you're listening, please take this into account. Thank you.
All right. So going electric reduces these pollutants in part because they require less energy. An electric vehicle needs 3 times less energy than one with an internal combustion engine, and it covers 3 times the distance. Plus, it has none of those tailpipe emissions with the stuff Jay was mentioning.
There we go.
Okay, so these pollutants that Jay was mentioning, they're actually set to increase if we don't change the kind of cars we drive, considering we're driving more. In fact, the Department of Transportation found Americans drove more between April 2018 and April 2019 than any other 12-month span on record, and Americans are driving 40% more today than in 1994.
Yeah, and Scott, I gotta say, as an urban planner, that's not the stat that you want to hear for all of this talk about walkability and redesigning cities. That's still a ton of driving.
And in the 90s, people loved their cars. Like, it's amazing we love them that much more. I didn't know that.
I know, it's significant.
Okay, so what's needed to make e-mobility a reality, Jay?
First off is building out the charging station infrastructure. Charging stations could be in the home, or they could be publicly available. The best smelling. Oh boy. The best selling smart electric home vehicle charger on the market is Enel X's Juicebox 40, which has up to 7 times faster charging.
I love that name, Juicebox. It's like kids have their juice boxes for their health, and adults have their juice boxes for their cars.
And Scott, I'm actually not kidding here. I took pride in how quickly I could drink my juice boxes as a kid. I hope that I was able to drink them 7 times faster than other kids.
And now you'll take pride in how quickly your juice box charges your car.
So the workplace is another primary charging location, yet one study found 9 out of 10 EV drivers are not able to charge their vehicles at work. So there's certainly some room for improvement there.
Okay, yes. And hundreds of millions of EV charging stations may be required around the world. In the U.S., 88 of the 100 top metropolitan areas do not have enough EV charging infrastructure to support the expected 3 million EVs that will be on the road in the U.S. by 2025. Now, California is where half of the U.S.'s EVs are located. It has one of the more mature infrastructures in the U.S. at a charging station per 8 vehicles, but eventually we're going to need a 1-to-1 ratio to really make it convenient.
Utilities are also interested in providing EV infrastructure to optimize electricity supply and demand efficiently with smart charging. Smart charging refers to a charging system where electric vehicles, charging stations, and charging operators share data connections to optimize energy consumption and smooth out energy demand. Bloomberg estimates that as more EVs hit the road, smart charging could significantly reduce grid investment by 30 to 70% for grid operators. This represents up to billions of dollars on a yearly basis. Plus, states are working with public utility commissions and utilities to test different types of infrastructure, so that's an area to keep your eye on.
Rarely do we have an episode where we're not talking about billions of dollars saved. I love it. So, it's important that we make these charging stations smart, convenient, and fast. Enel X offers smart charging stations that in less than an hour of charging, charge vehicles to go up to about 250 miles. That's a lot. Also, beyond cars, we need the infrastructure to support other forms of e-mobility, like e-bikes and e-scooters. These electric-powered modes of transport used for shorter trips are referred to as electric micromobility. There will actually be many more e-bikes sold in the coming years, as estimates for the mid-2020s put annual e-bike sales at more than 40 million, while electric vehicles look to be more around 12 million.
And Scott, of course, e-scooters are pretty big too.
The scary e-scooter.
There were actually 2 million more trips on e-scooters than e-bikes in 2018, and almost that many videos that circulated on the internet of people just toppling them over if they were parked in the wrong location.
Yeah.
Beyond the charging locations, we also need to modernize the grid. Modernization will allow the grid to accommodate more types of renewable power generation. More renewables incorporated means a grid that is more resilient to extreme weather. Plus, the sensors and other technology that make the grid smart allow for charging at non-peak times and open up additional energy efficiency opportunities.
So, by one estimate, to supply millions of EVs and meet its normal load, the grid in the United States would need 20% more capacity. McKinsey found the United States will need $11 billion of capital investment by 2030 to deploy the 13 million chargers needed for all of the country's EVs. So we need chargers and we need a modern grid.
Scott, in addition to those two, we also need people to get over their range anxiety, which is the concern that the car will run out of juice mid-trip with no place to charge up. So an important fact here is that in the United States in 2017, 60% of all trips were less than 6 miles, and 95% of them were less than 30 miles. That's well within a single charge of basically all electric vehicles.
Ultimately, we have a long way to go to an all-electric fleet. There are 1.2 billion cars on the road globally today, and that will grow to 2 billion over the next 20 years. Only about 5 million cars in 2018 were electric. That's less than half of 1% of the total.
Yeah.
Kind of daunting. Only 2% of the 5.3 million cars sold in the U.S. last year were electric. Interestingly, the largest electric car market is China. Norway is actually the global leader in terms of market share, with almost half of new car sales being electric and about 7% of cars in that country being electric.
However, Scott, EVs are a growth market. In 2019, EVs grabbed 2.2% of the global vehicle market over the first 10 months as a slew of new models hit the road. Plus, looking into the future, Bloomberg New Energy Finance estimates that 57% of all passenger car sales globally by 2040 will be electric.
Right. So if we're going to meet that estimate, we're going to need some ways to accelerate this transition, Jay. Let's talk about some.
Oh, what a beautiful transition.
Shall we? Thank you. All right. So one way to accelerate I like how we're also putting that in terms of like car terms,
Uh-huh.
is through policy. For example, some cities are creating incentives and mandates to switch to electric cars. London actually started offering, I love how it's offering, they imposed
It's a nice British way to phrase it.
Yeah, have a congestion charge. They started offering a congestion charge in 2003, and in April 2019 started applying an extra charge to the dirtiest vehicles in a central part of the city it called the ultra low emission zone. EVs are actually exempt from the congestion charge and the newer extra charge for the dirty vehicles. These policy changes in London have had an immediate effect. By October 2019, nitrogen dioxide levels in the air had declined by 36% compared to February 2017, and there were nearly 13,500 fewer of the most polluting vehicles in the city center on an average day compared to the month before the new rules were instituted. Prime Minister Boris Johnson actually took it a step further in February 2020, announcing that the UK wants to end the sale of petrol and diesel vehicles by 2035.
Yeah, and Scott, I gotta jump in and say here that while I was living in London, this is last year, it was kind of crazy because you would go and you wouldn't think about it. You'd wipe your nose, and you'd actually find soot that came out of your nose just from all this particulate matter in London. So certainly they're taking the right steps. There's still a ways to go, and maybe I should just stop picking my nose in the first place. So, anyways, London isn't the only city looking at a ban on internal combustion vehicles altogether. Amsterdam plans to have gasoline and diesel engine cars out of the city center by 2030, largely to clean up its air. There are leaders in the U.S. too. One such state, maybe somewhat surprisingly, is New Jersey, the land that gave us the infamous Jersey Shore. In January 2020, it passed an ambitious law with a target of 330,000 EVs on the road by 2025, and 85% of cars sold in the state to be electric by 2040. The law includes $300 million in rebates over 10 years that immediately reduce the price of the car. New Jersey's bill also calls for charging stations across the state to reduce that range anxiety.
So I love that example, but I have to say I'm still thinking about how you told all the listeners you pick your nose. So anyway.
Oh, man. Maybe I'll edit that. Listeners, we'll see.
All right. So another way to accelerate e-mobility is through not just people purchasing more electric cars, but also companies and governments. Companies control more than half the vehicles on the road today.
That's right, Scott. In January 2020, major companies including Amazon, AT&T, Cliff Bar, and Siemens formed the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance. The alliance will help member companies make and achieve bold commitments to fleet electrification, and is expected to boost the electric vehicle market by signaling the breadth and scale of corporate demand for EVs. Plus, Scott, it's important to note that electrifying the fleet is critical to many of the climate goals of these companies in the first place.
Right. And ride-hailing companies, Jay, should also look at making more of their fleets EVs, given the decreased climate impact of EV rides. An electric shared ride-hailing trip can cut emissions by about 68% compared with a private vehicle trip in the average car. So the ride-hailing companies are taking this on. In some markets, Lyft has a green mode, so users can select an EV or a hybrid vehicle, and Lyft has actually established an EV rental option for drivers.
Scott, can we say that with this news, Uber has its own green mode of envy?
Oh, nice.
Thank you. So a third means of acceleration is simply bringing the cost of EVs down.
Just bring it down.
As more electric vehicles are made, the price should continue to drop.
Right. And GM announced in 2017 that it would be selling 20 electric vehicle models by 2040. And it said in 2019, many of them won't have quote-unquote luxury vehicle prices. Now, what's making the electric vehicle so expensive is often the battery. Its cost, though, has fallen dramatically. It went from $2,500 a kilowatt hour to $400. And that's like an 84% decrease.
That's huge.
It's huge. And now it's on its way to being $100 a kilowatt hour, which many believe is the magic number, where EVs can be at cost parity without subsidies with internal combustion vehicles. McKinsey estimates that fleet EVs can have a total cost of ownership 15 to 25% less than that of equivalent internal combustion engine vehicles by 2030. So McKinsey thinks they'll be less expensive quite a bit by 2030.
One current way prices are reduced is with the federal non-refundable tax credit of $7,500 for electric vehicles. But at the same time, many low-income people don't owe that much in taxes in the first place, so it's not a benefit to them.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's available for only the first 200,000 cars a manufacturer sells, and GM and Tesla have both already hit that ceiling.
Mm-hmm.
The good news, though, is that after purchase, the costs of EVs tend to be less. There's less maintenance, and there's no oil changes to pay for. Plus, filling up with electricity tends to be less than gas. With the average U.S. cost of electricity at 12 cents per kilowatt hour, a person driving the average EV 15,000 miles annually will spend roughly at current prices $540 per year, or about $45 per month to charge their car. This represents a savings of about $860 per year over gasoline-powered cars.
Right, so once you have the thing, you're saving money. So especially if we make the actual car itself cheaper, we're really onto something.
That's a classic twofer.
Mm-hmm, love it. Okay, so Jay, let's talk though about potential issues with this transition to e-mobility. The most typical criticism is that this transition will mean more electricity use, and if that energy is derived from fossil fuels, won't that exacerbate the issues we've discussed, like climate change and air pollution? Now, certainly, if an EV was charged solely by electricity generated from coal, this would mean a high amount of what's called indirect emissions. Indirect emissions refers to the emissions produced in the burning of fossil fuels at power plants to produce electricity for commercial and residential uses. The reality, though, is that renewables and cleaner fuel sources continue to be integrated into electricity generation across the United States. So it's not like you're filling up on a whole bunch of coal energy, typically.
Right.
This is partly why, on average in the United States, carbon emissions per mile to an electric vehicle today are 45% less than those from a gas-fueled vehicle of a similar size.
One alternative that ensures clean energy is charging stations that are independent of the grid. For example, Envision Solar sells solar-powered electric charging stations. Also, in some places, the guarantee can be made that all power from an EV charging station is from renewable sources. In Italy, in fact, Enel X's charging points source 100% of their power from renewable sources. And even when not from 100% renewable sources, software such as Enel X's JuiceNet can tell you how much carbon dioxide will be emitted on a per mile basis based on which power plants are charging your EV. And they can charge your EV based on when renewable sources are maximized. A lot of good stuff coming out of JuiceNet.
Yeah, smart stuff. So another area for improvement, though, is those batteries again, Jay. So sourcing the minerals used for lithium-ion batteries, dismantling the batteries which have deteriorated, and building and delivering the vehicles to consumers worldwide all involve CO2 emissions. Still, an EV with a lithium-ion battery has about half the emissions compared to the average gas-powered vehicle over the lifetime of the EV. Now, an issue with the batteries, though, still is the rare earth minerals that are required to make a battery. There was one piece of research that found that to convert just the 31 million cars in the UK to EVs would require 2 times the total annual world cobalt production, nearly the entire world production of neodymium, 3/4 of the world's lithium-ion production, and at least half of the world's copper production during 2018. Even if it's not quite that much, the point is a lot of these rare earth minerals are used in this battery production.
That's right, Scott, and it's important that advancements continue to be made in the responsible sourcing of these minerals. Some are looking at alternatives, including those focused on batteries based in zinc, which is relatively more plentiful than cobalt and lithium. Of course, it's also important that we advance our ability to use these batteries for energy storage once they no longer make sense for cars, and ultimately to recycle them so that the rare earth metals are captured and not just thrown away.
Right, so a lot of promise with e-mobility. There's some issues, but we can overcome them, and it's pretty exciting, don't you think, Jay? The growth in this industry and the benefits that can come from this stuff.
Well, Scott, we've talked about it. You see ads, you see much more hype around these EVs that's popped up in a really short time. So I'm excited to see this growth continue.
And Jay, let's learn more about e-mobility from our expert guest, Enel X's Giovanni Bertolino. So Enel X is leading the energy transformation all over the world with solutions that allow businesses, cities, and people to use energy in new ways. It has 4 global product lines: e-industries, e-mobility, e-home, and e-city. That's a lot of E's. With e-mobility, it focuses on promoting increasingly widespread and efficient electric mobility and smart charging infrastructure. Think like vehicle grid integration.
Enel X has deployed over 80,000 smart charging stations globally. Its technology in the e-mobility space includes the JuiceBox EV charging station, the #1 seller on Amazon, and also its JuiceNet IoT software that allows customers to charge their EVs automatically in a way that considers the availability of renewable energy and the cost of energy during different times of the day.
So Giovanni Bertolino is Enel X's head of e-mobility. Sounds like a good person to bring on, huh, Jay?
I can't wait.
In the USA and Canada, he has an MBA from New York University, worked for several years at McKinsey, and has been at Enel X for more than 10 years. All right, Jay, let's take our e-scooters over to Giovanni and hear what he has to say.
All right, listeners, we are now joined by Giovanni Bertolino, who is the head of e-mobility USA and Canada at Enel X. We're here to talk e-mobility. Giovanni, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we'd like to get things started with a little bit on your background. So what got you interested in sustainability in the very first place? Was it something you were exposed to earlier on in your career? I know we've had many interesting career steps, but when did this idea first strike you?
Well, it came a bit later on. When I started my career, I was consultant in McKinsey. I mean, sustainability was more financial sustainability, and over time it became a much broader concept, and environment and use of resources became much more important. I remember later on in my period in McKinsey, I led a global exercise on future trends. As part of the strategy practice, we were looking at, okay, what is going to shape the next 30, 40 years? And that's where I started seeing the issues of use of resources, of population growth, of environment as key themes. And then I started seeing how these themes could become very practical and business opportunities in the short term. So I started looking at instruments, the carbon offsets. So this mechanism that was part of the Kyoto Protocol that helped funnel money from high-income countries to less developed countries to support investment in decarbonization. And actually that's what then brought me to Enel, because my next step after consulting was I joined Enel to work on climate change and carbon regulation. So there I spent all my time advocating for low carbon policies, for decarbonization in the energy sector and beyond, at global level, at UNFCCC conferences, and at the European level, where there are a number of mechanisms in place, like the emission trading scheme. So that's really where I got engaged in issues around how do we tame climate change, how do we deal with emissions, with pollutants, and that has become part of it's a key piece of Enel strategy, which is one of the reasons I really enjoy working in Enel, with the commitment that we have in decarbonizing the electricity sector, and most recently also decarbonizing the transportation sector through electrification, which ultimately brought me to e-mobility.
Yeah, no, Giovanni, I mean, it's impressive that you've touched on so many different parts of the sustainability landscape over the course of your career. And this look of future trends is interesting that you saw it in there and you've stuck with it. Mm-hmm. And now you're at this group that is so focused, like you say, on the clean energy landscape and decarbonizing, really big sectors that are responsible for a lot of our greenhouse gas footprint. So can you tell us a bit, you've had several different roles that we detailed in the introduction at Enel. What have you learned through the course of your role and your time at Enel on the clean energy landscape?
Well, one of my first learning was really that the right incentives and market mechanism can be very powerful in incentivizing behaviors that can help address these global and overarching issues. These mechanisms can be very effective, but they need constant fine-tuning. It's not something that you can just throw out and it will work forever. The market will adjust. New things will come on. There will be new technologies, new ways to do things, and you need to keep adjusting the target.
So, Giovanni, you've clearly got a fantastic position, and you've been able to trace these trends in renewable energy over the years and throughout your career. Let's move now into your current role at Enel X. So we shared our definition with e-mobility with our listeners at the top of the show. So with this overall concept of e-mobility fresh in our minds, let's focus more on Enel X as a company that exists within this market. So could you walk us through the Enel X e-mobility business model and maybe describe how Enel X wants to transform our energy and transportation systems generally?
E-mobility is one of the business lines, or we call it verticals, of Enel X. Enel X overarching goal is to support our customers in transitioning towards a better use of energy resources and a greater use of electricity for all energy uses. Because we believe that in the electricity sector, there is a clear roadmap towards a full decarbonization that is going to happen clearly in a matter of a few more years, because renewable generation has become in more and more countries more competitive than conventional generation. Enel X wants to help our customers, being residential, commercial, enterprises, government, to use more electricity, because electricity will become greener, and by using more electricity, we can make other sectors become greener. And the bigger one, we feel, is transportation. Transportation is globally either the second or the third major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. If we can electrify transportation while electricity gets decarbonized, we can ultimately decarbonize transportation as well, with a huge impact on the environment.
Yeah, so Giovanni, before I ask you about the EV charging system, you talk about the importance of electrifying the cars while in tandem decarbonizing the energy system. So is Enel playing on both sides of those, or just the electrifying the cars? Or is it also focused on decarbonizing the way we produce the energy?
No, we're very much focused on both. Actually,
okay.
Our focus on transportation is recent, I would say. I mean, we started developing e-mobility charging infrastructure technology several years ago, but we started our push in that segment since the last 3 years. While on renewables, we started our journey towards the decarbonization of the electricity sector about 10 years ago, when we created Enel Green Power, which is our arm developing renewable energy all over the world. Enel Green Power is now the largest owner and operator of renewable generation, with more than 46 gigawatt of installed capacity between hydro, wind.
Well, then I'd say you're a little bit involved in the decarbonizing the energy. Okay, if you're the largest. So I guess then tell us about the EV charger, the more recent innovation. Like, how is Enel innovating in that space? Like, why is that so important to this whole process?
So as we said before, our goal is to electrify transportation. In order to electrify transportation, you need two things, and they're kind of connected. The classic chicken and egg problem. You need to have electric cars, and you need to have electric infrastructure. If people don't see that there is an electric infrastructure that can address the range anxiety and so on, won't buy the car. And if manufacturers don't see that people are going to buy the car, they don't produce the car. So we can't really help on the car making side, but we are very happy to see that more and more car models are coming to the market, and more automakers are embarking on the journey of electrifying their offering. But what we can help is on providing the charging infrastructure to make sure that electric vehicle drivers can find a charger along their way when they embark in a journey, or most likely they are able to charge at home conveniently and easily. Our set of solution targets both needs, so the public charging infrastructure, where we are really focused on the Enel, let's say, home markets, which are in Europe, like Italy and Spain, and a bit of Latin America. That's really where we're making a big push on public charging. But we have a great solution for private charging, either being at home or at the workplace or supporting fleet, that can be used very easily and provide additional value to drivers, and not only. What we realized is that the more electric vehicles come to the grid, the more grid operators, so utilities, might have a concern of how that will impact the use of the grid. I mean, every electric car will consume more or less the same amount of energy that a regular household consumes. So it's a significant increase in electricity consumption. The concern will be, is the grid, the current grid that we have, enough to cope with that additional consumption? Are there ways to manage effectively that additional load? Well, we feel that our solution, the solution that we develop or we focus on, is really on the smart charging capabilities. So when the charging happen, can help integrate more EVs on the grid without too much of a strain on the capability of the grid to accommodate for that load.
Okay, so Giovanni, maybe let's go back just quickly, because you touched on how the grid can adapt to better handle the load, but let's go back first to the economics. So you said that you serve both the public stations and people in their homes. So let's say I am a home buyer and I just bought an electric car and I want to make sure that I have the electricity for it. How does it work? Do I just go to your website and buy a system I put in my home, and what are the economics? Like, how much does it cost, and how quick is that payback?
Yes, if you buy a car, you have several options to charge. You can charge on the street, on the public charging infrastructure, usually for pay, and can often be a fast charger. So that's very good for long trips. You could charge at home by simply plugging the cord that the manufacturer will give you to the regular plug, which, however, will be very slow, extremely slow. So what we provide is what is called a level 2 charger. So it's a fast charger, but not high fast, not super fast. It will allow to charge about 10 to 13 times faster than a regular outlet. And you can buy it on our website. You can buy it on Amazon, for instance. You could get it through some of the utilities we work on. We work with more than 30 utilities in the United States. And if you are in one of their territories that they serve, you could get a charger through them, usually at a discount or some form of subsidy.
So it's mainly an efficiency thing. Like, it just charges faster.
Yes, you can charge it faster. But then what you can do is, so of course you need to bring it home. You need to have, you can have either a plugged version, but you need like a a drying machine plug, the big one, or you need an electrician to come home and make the installation. And once you install it, our chargers are Wi-Fi connected. So you will connect it to internet, and we will be able to provide a number of additional services. So we can help you optimize the charging of the car based on time of use rates, if your utility has those, so that you can optimize the cost of your charging. If you'd like, we could optimize the charging based on the emission intensity of the electricity flowing in the grid in your service territory. So if you want to have the greenest possible energy, we have algorithms that can support that.
I thought for a second there you were going to say, if you would like, we can give you an electric car and you can try this and then tell the listeners how it works. And I'd be like, sure. I'd be happy to test an electric car.
Scott,
I've went a different direction with it.
I've been waiting to ask Giovanni if we can get like a branded, sustainability defined podcast EV charger. Like it's like green color and everybody gets to see the logo.
I think our green would look good on a car.
I think it would look fantastic.
Yeah, let's work on it. Let's see if we can do that.
So Giovanni, you touched on a few different elements of this smart charging idea, right? Where you can, very much control when the car charges, when grid prices are lower, or instead optimize for when, again, as you said, we can minimize carbon emissions based on the type of electricity that's currently in the grid. And we're talking about this, at least from the U.S. perspective, a private perspective. Earlier on, you mentioned that over in Europe, in countries like Spain and Italy, you're pushing more of the public infrastructure. So I'm curious, from this global perspective, what differences do you see between Europe and the U.S.? Is there a certain percentage that we're behind as far as public infrastructure? Is the majority of what you're installing in the U.S. private? How does that shake out?
If I look at the broader picture, comparing Europe versus U.S., I see residential charging much more widespread in the U.S. than in Europe.
Like they have better public infrastructure, I would think, right? So they don't need the individual residential?
No, in the U.S. You have much more individual homes,
right,
while in Europe you have more multi-unit dwellings. When you have multi-unit dwellings, sometimes you park on the street. Maybe you have an open garage, so without assigned places. So there is a bit less opportunity to install a charger in your garage and in your driveway at your home, just because of how the setup of housing is.
Freaking Americans need their own homes.
Yes,
it is interesting how those differences in from my perspective as a real estate guy, how real estate development patterns influence the way EVs will eventually get to consumers. And it's cool that Enel X is positioning itself to be able to touch both. Giovanni, while we're on this topic of smart charging and EVs, we've heard a lot of buzz about what's called vehicle grid integration and this concept of, quote, V2G, end quote. So in a nutshell, V2G is the use of idle car batteries as a source of power that can be sent back into the grid when the car is plugged in. So the question to you in your position of expertise, is this V2G concept viable? Why or why not? And then what are the main challenges to scaling V2G generally?
So vehicle grid integration has two variations. There is V1G and V2G. V1G is what we currently offer and do, which is a number of smart capabilities in the use of the charger, in the way the charger draws electricity from the grid. V2G is the next level, where the charger becomes bidirectional and you can either draw electricity from the grid or put back electricity from the battery of the car into the grid. We're very strong on V1G. And V2G, it is absolutely technical feasible. We have run a number of pilots, so we know the technology, we know how to make it work. The issue there is that it's much more expensive. The infrastructure that you need, so the hardware that you need in order to do V2G is more expensive than V1G. Also, you need to have cars which are compatible. Not all cars allow for the energy from the battery to be withdrawn and put back on the grid.
Why wouldn't they allow that? Is there some issue that the car manufacturers are concerned about, or they're just not dealing with it right now because it's not a big thing?
I think it's both. So first of all, I think the first concern was really from the demand side. I mean, if in the early stage, if you were an EV buyer and you know that you're going to spend a lot of money. I'm talking a few years ago. A lot of money for the battery pack, which is beneath your driving seat. You're saying, I mean, why should I let somebody else use my batteries to provide services? I mean, what's the value in that for me? Is that going to affect my warranty, my usage of the lifetime of the car? So there was a lot of resistance there. I think now that resistance might be a bit dispelled for two reasons. The battery packs are much cheaper, and they're going to be cheaper and cheaper as we go on. And the second thing, especially with cars with big batteries, people are realizing that they can drive an incredible amount of miles, which is probably way more the usual time people own a car. I mean, if you could drive the car for like 15 years, I mean, is everybody going to own the same car for 15 years? So I think that concern is getting a bit dispelled, yet not many car manufacturers are embarking on that. The second point is, are there enough economic incentives to attract people to provide those services? I think this goes back to our beginning of our conversation. You need to have the right incentives to drive behaviors. There are few places where there are market rules that allow for proper participation and enough monetary value for providing V2G, especially for passenger cars. I mean, passenger cars are small batteries. You need to aggregate many of those. It's a complex business. Maybe one area where this could start earlier could be like buses or school buses in particular, where, school bus drives 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon. The rest of the day is idle, and you have a big battery there. Maybe that's an area where we might see V2G starting to be implemented earlier than the rest.
Right. And you talked about the importance of decarbonizing the energy grid and not just putting out more electric vehicles. And it sounds like V2G is one possible way that could really be accelerated. And that takes me to, I know a common criticism we've heard of EVs is that, yeah, you're switching it to energy, but what if that energy was made with fossil fuels and it has an impact? So how does Enel X talk through that now? Can you assure customers that the energy they're using in their cars is from renewables? And maybe on top of that, can you just talk us through any common misconceptions about EVs that you often have to correct?
Yeah, I think that's really the biggest thing. I mean, we see these coming out in the newspapers continuously. I mean, all these statistics and studies on how much CO2 emissions are related to driving on EV cars. Now they've even moved to the entire the value chain and saying, the entire CO2 emissions since the manufacturing until the decommissioning of an electric car is higher than a conventional internal combustion engine. I think many of these analyses are misplaced or misconducted. First of all, the carbon intensity of the electricity in the grid is very variable from place to place, from country to country. So these analyses will need to be much more specific. But second, we know that the electricity grid is going to be decarbonized. So what might be true today in certain places will not be true tomorrow or 1 year from now or 5 years from now. So it is clear that the electricity production is going to be decarbonized. And as such, electric vehicles will enjoy carbon-free or much lower carbon electricity. And same goes for the manufacturing of the electric cars and the batteries. More and more factories, companies are committing to buy renewable energies for their activities. So at some point, we will have electric cars who are manufactured with renewable energy, who run on renewable energy, who are decommissioned with renewable energy. So the CO2 emission of that will be completely zero. We cannot say the same for internal combustion engine. So if you buy today an internal combustion car and you keep it for the next 10 years, for sure you will emit CO2 emissions for the next 10 years, while an electric car will not, or at least way less. And on top of that, we should not forget the emission of other pollutants that internal combustion engines do, while electric cars do not, which has a huge impact on cities, on the streets where we live.
I am curious about, I think, another possible misconception, or at least perception here in the U.S., where I know we talked earlier about here in the U.S., the private infrastructure is pretty well built out. In Europe, public infrastructure much more so. But, I've heard that some folks are like, yeah, well, I want an EV, but if I take it on a road trip, I don't know if there's going to be enough public infrastructure for me to charge it along the way. Kind of like we have with gas stations out here.
And we love our single family homes and we love road trips. So, all right, Jim.
This is America, right? So,
and pickup trucks.
And pickup trucks, yes.
Maybe throw some barbecue in there also. So, so Giovanni, when we've talked about this earlier, we know that the vast majority of charging happens at the home or at the office if your company gets it and supplies EV chargers. But do you think as this market for EV grows that we can expect more public infrastructure here in the U.S. at least to help this chicken and egg situation that, again, you alluded to earlier, where now that we see this infrastructure across the country, well, wow, now it's way easier for me to get an EV?
So the answer is yes. It is not immediately easy, however, because the reality is that we'll continue to see a lot of charging happening at home. Actually, I read this survey that AAA did recently on among EV drivers, and one of the questions was, "Are you concerned? Is range anxiety still a concern for you after you have driven an electric car?"
Yeah.
And like 72%, if I remember correctly, the number said no. So I think range anxiety is a big concern before buying an electric car. Once you buy it and you start using it, you realize that it's not a big deal. And actually, if you want to go on a road trip, there are already a lot of public charging infrastructure across the country. Are there enough? No, for sure. The challenge for public charging infrastructure, however, is complex because it is a very expensive infrastructure. It requires upgrades to the grid in order to deliver enough power, to have enough charging stations functioning and available when you want to charge. I mean, if you go on a road trip and you stop by, you want to be sure that there is at least one charger available and functioning.
Yeah, I mean, but I will say I feel like in the U.S. I just don't see it all that often. I'm not hit with it that often, so I feel like I would have range anxiety if I didn't see it. So I'm wondering, and you talk about we need more, is it a policy thing that could help us get more of these charging stations out there, or is there something else? You talk about the difficulties with the economics. Is it a policy change to try to change that, or something else?
I think policy is the biggest help, and policy is twofold. I mean, in order to make these investments viable, you need to have many more EVs on the streets, and you need to have, at the same time, you need many more chargers. So it's a classic chicken and egg. I think policy is what is needed to support that. There are mechanisms that work. So California has put in place some grants, has put in place the low carbon fuel standard that helps in providing economic incentive to that. There is discussion now in Congress about pushing for building chargers along all the highways. Certain states like New Hampshire, Vermont, I've seen they've been launching RFPs to have chargers along their ways. I think public policy and support is key to get this started. And the more chargers, the more cars, and at some point these chargers will be economically viable because there will be enough electric cars along the street that we will use them and will pay for them for their services.
Giovanni, I know as this EV tech continues to evolve, hopefully with the help of a lot of these policy-making tools, we're curious, what are some interesting ways that utility companies are starting to take advantage of the tech that underlies EV charging systems and, of course, other components that you work on at Enel X?
Yes. No, as I was mentioning before, one of the concern is, okay, we're going to have all these cars. These cars are going to charging. It's a lot of electricity flowing. Is the grid enough to sustain that? So that's the headache for utilities. I mean, how much they're going to need to invest to upgrade their grids. One way to manage that is, first of all, understanding how the charging behavior happens, what are the charging patterns, how much of all this charging is indeed coincident and impacting the use of the grid. So the first thing that we do in working with the utilities we're partnering with is providing information. So we can collect all the metering data of all the chargers, and we provide that information to utilities. The utilities can use that to design time of use rates, incentive schemes, or how to better manage or upgrade their grid on the basis of that information. The second thing is that we can operate those chargers within the flexibility that the drivers give us. Let's say you go back home and you put the car on the charger at night when you get back home, and you can put in the app, you can say, I need the car ready tomorrow morning, like at 7 a.m. Right? So we know that we have 10, 12 hours available for charging your car. That's a significant amount of time, and that gives us some flexibility. We can use that flexibility to manage the charging, interrupting it if needed when the grid is on has need for relief. So we can provide demand response or load management to utilities or to the market where those mechanisms are allowed. That can bring back that flexibility, allowing for a better usage of the infrastructure which is currently available. In California, for instance, we are able to aggregate about 40 megawatt of capacity through our chargers, and with that, we participate to the CAISO market.
Do you have a sense of like how long until all cars sold will be 100% electric? What's your guess? Is this like a 2050 thing?
I think 100% electric, it will be probably 10 to 15 years. 100% electric in the most advanced markets.
That's ambitious. I would bet on an electric car. That's not going to happen, but I hope you're right. I hope
in 15 years, 10 years, one of us might be owed an EV. Is that right, Scott?
Yes,
that's right,
yes.
That's right.
I think we'll see still a lot of plug-in hybrid because people might feel that gives the best of the both worlds. I personally don't like them because I believe that if you have a plug-in hybrid, it's very easy to go back to the common pattern of just fueling your car at the fuel station and forgetting about charging. So I see them actually a bit more expensive and not necessarily more useful. So I think the transition really needs to be towards full EVs. But we need to get there. I mean, we need to get all the kind of cars that people would like to drive. I mean, we need to get pickup trucks, and we need to get SUVs. I mean, all the entire range of cars people like to drive, and we need to provide the infrastructure so that people would not have any concern, any anxiety about driving an electric car.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And Giovanni, let's move into our final question here, which is the question we ask all of our guests. And let's pretend that we're on our way to a party, actually, in an electric car, and it's kind of far away, but we have no range anxiety, we're feeling good, but I'm out of podcasts, with the person I'm with, and I don't really know what else to say, but I want to tell them something cool about electric cars and e-mobility on the way to the party. What is the one party fact that I could throw out to the person I'm with in the electric car about e-mobility?
In the Bay Area last year, one quarter of new cars were electric. More than one quarter of new cars were electric. So it's coming. It's there.
All right. Well, San Francisco, I guess that's the place to be that is the hub of e-mobility.
It is. We're in San Carlos, deep in the Bay Area. It's a great place to be. We're seeing electric cars everywhere. Our parking lot is full of electric cars. Almost everybody in our team drives an electric car. And we're just looking forward to make that available to everybody, and with our chargers, of course.
Well, Giovanni, we're coming to you from Denver and DC, so we're hoping that maybe after the Bay Area, our two cities will be the next two hubs. How about that?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, Giovanni, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through such an exciting topic that I know a lot of folks are excited about. So we appreciate all of your insights, and we hope to see more EVs on the road as soon as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks, Giovanni.
All right, Scott, we've come to the end of the episode, and my EV has officially run out of battery.
Well, Jay, I think it's time for a juice box. I got you apple to make you feel better.
Oh, thank you.
An apple juice.
I will note, Scott, that I had no range anxiety during this trip, and it just happened to run out of battery when there's a juice box available.
That's fair. Okay, Jay, so we've got some thank yous to give out. First of all is Katie Fehrenbacher. She is a transportation writer for GreenBiz. We recommend you sign up for GreenBiz's Transportation Weekly newsletter. It comes every Tuesday to your mailbox email mailbox. If you're interested in these transportation issues and you want the latest, sign up for that newsletter. We also want to thank Matt Ahrens, who continues to be our rockstar social media extraordinaire. So if you like our Instagram posts and stuff, it was probably Matt behind him. So thanks, Matt.
It was definitely Matt behind him.
Matt.
We also want to thank Square Peg Round Hole and Potions for the music we've used in our episodes since day one. And of course, listeners, please rate, review, and subscribe to our show wherever you get your podcasts. If you listen on iTunes, please leave a review such as the one Scott has prepared for us.
And Jay, we just looked at our reviews, and we have had several in the past month. We only have time to read one, but we read them. Warms our hearts. So
Absolutely.
Even if we're not reading yours, it helps us get seen, and it warms our hearts. So it's worth it. All right, here is a review from T. Tagdmeyer that he or she left on February 13th, 2020. This is a great podcast covering a wide range of sustainability topics, very informative with great facts and stats to share with your network. Great interviews with a very diverse group of sustainability professionals. Keep up the great work and terrible jokes, Scott and Jay. T. Tagdmeyer.
I feel so heard. Scott, before we sign off, we do want to share a cool piece of news that came to us recently. We were nominated for iHeartRadio's Best Green Podcast. And admittedly, this is not necessarily all that recent. In fact, Scott, you and I only found out about this because we just happened to Google the podcast one day. We find this result. Turns out we've been nominated back in November. This is really cool. We're going to find out more about it, hopefully win that thing next year. But that was a really cool award to see come through.
I'm saving my acceptance speech. Thank you, Adrian Breen. All right, Jay. I think that about does it. You all stay sustainable out there. I'm Scott Breen.
And I'm Jay Siegel. We will see you next time.